Welcome to the Far Hill Speaker Series. On behalf of the Wright Memorial Public Library and the Oakwood Historical Society, we are pleased to present the second in a series of 3 presentations about Dayton in World War II. My name is Lee Turbin, and I'm the president of the Oakwood Historical Society. As World War II rolled out across the Atlantic, a flurry of war-related activity played out right here in Dayton, Ohio. From code breakers to top secret laboratories to Russian spies, the Dayton region's influence on World War II was indisputable. Today, we are pleased to introduce Polonium in the Playhouse, the second presentation of our World War II trilogy. This presentation features author Linda Carrick Thomas as she discusses her new book, Polonium in the Playhouse. During World War II, the Talbot family's Runnymede Playhouse in Oakwood, Ohio, served as a top-secret laboratory where the triggering mechanism for the atomic bombs were developed. Ms. Thomas tells a fascinating story about the Talbots, the Playhouse, the Manhattan Project in Dayton, and the Soviet spy in their midst. Linda Carrick Thomas is a freelance writer focusing on science and engineering research and just happens to be the granddaughter of Charles Allen Thomas, the director of Monsanto and a coordinator of the Manhattan Project. Linda has been a newspaper reporter specializing in the arts and today works in higher education communications. Her book, The Polonium in the Playhouse, is available for purchase at the Oakwood Historical Society. And now, Polonium in the Playhouse.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I think that Dayton is or deserves as much credit for this book as I do for writing it. I couldn't have done it, obviously, without the Oakwood community and the knowledge of the people who are here. So I'm very thankful to the Oakwood Historical Society for their help, and Wright Library and City of Dayton. Numerous parts of Dayton helped with this. I was looking online about how to give a talk, and I'm a trivia nut, so I came across a piece of trivia I thought I would share with you. A fellow named Andrew Torgay, a professor at the University of North Texas, gave a Guinness Book of World Records talk lasting 26 hours and 33 minutes. It consisted of something like 1,600 PowerPoint slides and 500 pages of notes, and I'm very happy to tell you that I will not speak that long today. Instead, I'm going to talk about what I think is just a marvel of science and engineering that took place in almost as short and condensed an amount of time as Professor Torgay's talk, and that is the Manhattan Project, which from 1942, when the first nuclear reaction occurred at the University of Chicago, until 1945 in August, when the bomb was dropped, really pretty much in 3 years created nuclear science from scratch, more or less. And that's something that has always just fascinated me. How did these men and women working round the clock, solving one challenge after another, manage to create a new field of science and to overcome unknown challenges? It really is miraculous. Dayton played a role in this, as I think most of you know, with the work of Monsanto Chemical Company, which was here on Nicholas Road. in the 40s and had wartime contracts, the most secret of which was for the polonium purification site for the Manhattan Project. So Oakwood played a very key role in the success of the bomb, but never really received any attention after the fact in the histories. And part of that is just because it was such classified work. In writing the history of the work in Dayton, I really sought to blend science and the technical detail and the history of the project with the human life of the people who worked on the project. And it's that human element that really interested me and was, I thought, critical to writing a book that a general audience, not a specialized technical audience, might be likely to read. This is in the world of literature called a narrative history, not a technical history. I approached publishers with the idea, and unfortunately, most of them said, this is too narrow a subject matter. It's a niche audience. We won't take it. But Ohio State did the right thing in my mind, and they agreed to publish it. And I have to apologize for Purdue's performance yesterday, but I do work for Purdue, so I hope you'll still have me. I'm a member of Dayton's Talbot family, led at the turn of the century by civil engineer, financial magnate, and all-around amazing guy, Harold Talbot, and his wife, Catherine Howe Talbot, who in her own right was a pretty incredible woman, ahead of her time, a supporter of the arts here in Dayton, and both of them community leaders. They lived, and I think I'm already preaching to an audience who knows all of this, so bear with me. They lived on an estate that was called Runnymede at the top of a hill. It was a huge house. They had a huge family. They had 9 children, each one of whom went on to do fairly amazing things. And the youngest of their children, Margaret, known as Marnie, was my grandmother. In 1926, she married Charles Allen Thomas, an MIT-educated chemist from Lexington, Kentucky, who had come to Dayton for his first job, a position in the fuels research area with General Motors. Marnie's father, Harold, was a part owner of GM, and I think my grandfather was a little bit savvy that this was probably a good family to marry into. And so they were married. I love that 1920s wedding portrait. They look a little bit like mannequins to me. I'm not quite sure how the photographer managed that. Their first child was born in 1927. Charles Allen Thomas III. Charlie, as he was known, was my father. He visited Runnymede often. Oakwood was kind of a Talbot saturated area, and so his aunts and uncles, Meads, Houts, Greens, and so forth, his cousins were all around, and they all got together at Runnymede with grandmother Talbot. In 1927, the year he was born, she had decided to build a recreation building that the ever-expanding family could play in. The Talbot family, very athletic, very competitive, very creative, all qualities that Grandmother Talbot thought were essential to being a fully formed person. Those activities were all nurtured in the Playhouse, which had a tennis court, a stage, and was a place for social gatherings. The Talbot family, even when I was growing up, we were all required to perform skits and to be theatrical and to sing, to dance, to be very confident. I really didn't do any of those things, but I'm happy to say that years later, after my grandfather's death in 1982, I did write a book. So, but the Playhouse was designed for that, and it was quite a facility. The cars in the drive, which I'm sure some of you have seen this picture, the cars kind of give an idea of the scale. It was the largest private recreation building in the country at the time it was built. The pool that my father swam in, the entryway, one of the sitting areas. Grandmother Talbot could watch her offspring playing tennis. This is the cover of my book, and that actually is my grandmother in the lower right-hand corner, playing with her sisters. Again, for an idea of scale, 1,500 people or so could play bridge on the floor of the facility. I mean, it really is hard to imagine. But it was also used by the community. And by local school children from Harmon School who could walk across the hills and perform there during holidays. So while the family was recreating, and my father was growing up, in Europe, war was underway. And on the home front, the country here was starting to feel some shortages. One of them being the rubber shortage. My father recalls roaming the gullies near the house on Mad River Road where he grew up, looking for scrap rubber. He was 15 about that time. His father was head of Monsanto's Central Research Laboratory. Monsanto, having been primarily a pharmaceutical company to that point, famous for aspirin, had merged with Thomas and Hockwalt Laboratories on Nicholas Road to create a central laboratory where they could do their own primary research. And that is where my grandfather worked. One of the biggest contracts, as far as my father was concerned, as a 15-year-old, was a project to create synthetic rubber, which was being developed in a government program to combat the national rubber shortage. And so it was assumed by the family that my grandfather was never home because he was always off working on the rubber project. This could not have been further from the truth. He was, in fact, appointed in May 1943 coordinator of the Manhattan Project, Chemistry and Metallurgy, by Director General Leslie Groves on the left and Scientific Director Robert Oppenheimer. His job was to manage the chemists at all the sites across the project, the chemistry of the project, had become almost as important as the physics. The project, when it first started out, was focused on the physics of building a bomb, and then it became clear that materials in the chemistry division were important, and so they worked to create a chemistry division which was scattered all over the country, and they needed someone to coordinate all those different sites. And my grandfather, known to be a good administrator, was chosen for that role. He did, however, decline to move to Los Alamos, and this is possibly, I like to speculate because no one knows, my grandmother, Marnie Talbot, was a very strong-willed and probably high-maintenance wife, I'm guessing. And I think one of the reasons that he didn't go was that she, at that point, had 3 young children with more on the way. And I can imagine a conversation where she said, boy, if we have to leave Dayton, where her family was here to support, if we have to leave Dayton, then you can go by yourself. On the other hand, also, I think that he was beginning to really climb his way up in Monsanto and wanted to maintain his relationship with that company. So he took over the role of coordinator of chemistry and metallurgy and was gone all the time to meetings at the University of Chicago, and at least once a month was in Los Alamos. I was 21 when my grandfather died in 1982, so I had had a good chance to know him, but I knew nothing about this. I knew him as Papa, a retired Monsanto executive who demanded perfection, expected us all to be as extroverted as he was, had immense confidence, but he never spoke about the work in the Manhattan Project. And this is a common theme that I found in literature and in personal contact with people who worked on it. They were sworn to secrecy when the project ended, and for many of the 125,000 who worked on the project, that secrecy was kept until they died. He did, however, leave behind a letter written to his mother shortly after he witnessed the world's first atomic bomb explosion, the test at Trinity, and the family had that as the tip of the iceberg on the history. So there were many challenges for me in doing my research. It all started in 2004 when my father volunteered me, without asking, to be the family liaison with Dayton's National Park Service office, which was then lobbying Congress for inclusion of Dayton, the Dayton project sites, in a historic park. Dayton did not, in the end, win that recognition, but it allowed me to really get going on the book. So I came to Dayton in 2005 the first time, met with the National Park Service representatives, went to the Mound Museum, and took a look at some of the records that had been pulled together by the National Park Service folks. And the Dayton Project and the significance of my grandfather's work really came to life for me. It seemed like two important a project too important a history to ignore, and it was a perfect fit for me. I am a writer. I was a newspaper reporter for 15 years. I've been in higher education communications, first at Indiana University, and for the last 20 years at Purdue, where I primarily write magazine articles about research and technical subjects for general audiences. So it was a skill that I had developed and one that fit well with trying to tell this tricky story of the work in Dayton. In going through my grandfather's belongings, I came across a notebook. I'm going to fast forward through some of these slides. This is the site of the Playhouse now. It is, just a neighborhood hillside on Catherine, off of Catherine Terrace, and it really is all that I knew about the Dayton Project history until I came over here and started researching it. As far as the cousins, the younger generations of Talbots were concerned, the Playhouse was a mythical and fabulous building that had existed once upon a time and then was no longer around. In fact, I learned from going to Mound Laboratory that really all that remains of it is a small piece of glass from the roof and a couple of doorknobs. So when I started doing my own research and really dug into some of my grandfather's materials, I found this red scrapbook, leather, kind of Western tool cover, stamped in black with the word atomic bomb. And what could be more direct than that? Inside were newspaper clips from the time that the bomb was dropped. And then curiously, this painting. It's done in tempera, like a child's piece of art, with no name on it. I don't know who did it. Nobody in the family knows who did it, but I like it. It kind of served as my inspiration throughout the book project as kind of my quest to solve the mystery and the wonder of the Dayton Project. And so I include it here. If any of you know who did it, let me know. So as the work in Dayton on the polonium problem got going, there were sites. Monsanto headquarters on Nicholas Road was the administrative center. Bone Break Theological Seminary was where a lot of the research and the health physics, the early exploration of the effect of radiation on humans got going. But they needed a polonium production facility, a big open building. A lot of the buildings in Dayton were otherwise dedicated to war projects, and so the War Department leased the Playhouse. Couriers came and went at all hours through the neighborhood. This was one of the challenges I had in doing the research. There had been newspaper articles written about the work, but none of the information was ever substantiated. And in order to properly tell that story, I needed to be sure that what was out there really was true. And the first part of that was actually validating whether my grandfather had ever gone to Los Alamos. I had to kind of pick every piece of information that was out there and existing apart and go to the original source so that I knew it was true and not kind of urban legend. So the first thing I did was to contact Los Alamos National Laboratory and talk to their archivist and ask him if they had any information on whether my grandfather had been at Los Alamos. And he got back to me after a while and said, no, he never was here. Well, I was sure that that couldn't be true. So I dug and dug and dug, and a year later was deep into the National Archives. Most of them are Department of Energy archives. And I came across correspondence from Robert Oppenheimer to Leslie Groves, where he documented, it was a log that Groves had asked Oppenheimer to keep of every visitor in and out of Los Alamos. The more informal way they had tracked visitors was on index cards, an index card for every visitor. This was Robert Oppenheimer's official report, and there in the pages that I found was my grandfather's name and the dates of his trips into Los Alamos and when he had left. And they were monthly, and they recurred over the period of about 18 months. And so that was fantastic validation that he had indeed been there. One of the other challenges was, had my grandfather been asked to be associate director of the project? Historians who I had met kind of denied that. They never heard that. But I was able to get the exact date and time of his meeting with General Groves in Washington from General Groves's biographer, who had Groves's calendar, and it verified that. So a lot of this was detective work, and often took kind of a dogged approach to not giving up. No was really not an acceptable answer for me. There had to be another way to find that information. So the couriers coming in and out of Dayton, that had been a story that had been published in the Dayton Daily News. Neighbors had reported that they had seen cars in and out, but was that true? I'm happy to say that yes, they did drive through the neighborhood, past the very elegant residences at all hours of the day, taking this very route here onto Dixon Road, and that's where the Playhouse stood. They came and went at all hours. The folks from Oak Ridge, the military couriers who delivered material, often had to take the license plates off their cars. They changed into civilian clothing, but they packed a pistol under their shirts. And they often came so close to the schedule that the entire Manhattan Project is just a miracle in that everything was happening kind of in hyper speed, often sometimes kind of before it even existed. And one of the stories is that one of the oral histories from the Dayton Project is that the product, the polonium, often wasn't quite ready yet when the couriers arrived. And so they had to delay the couriers by making small talk until they could wrap it up, and the guys would take it off. This is the loading dock behind the Playhouse where they came and went. The greenhouses stored some of the product. And then after the war, due to extreme contamination. The Playhouse was returned to the Talbot family, but really only as a piece of bare land. It was so contaminated that the building was torn down. The ground was dug up many feet to pull the radiation out of the earth, and that was it. Going back a minute and talking about the archival work that I did, the research, which was my kind of obsessive quest to make sure I was telling the truth and not again putting misinformation out there or depending on urban legend or just people's stories. I spent an awful lot of time going through archival government records. And one of the things I had not expected, and I think there's probably still an easier way to do this, is that in researching National Archives, as some of you may have had experience, the catalogs are available online. You can look and, type in Manhattan Project and you find all kinds of stuff. But when you actually get down to the specific content, it has horrendously long coded numerical titles. Many, many digits and figures long. And it doesn't specifically say, for example, Playhouse demolition. And amazingly, one of the most frustrating searches I had to do in the whole project was tracking down the origin of the photos of the Playhouse as it was demolished. Those were out in public. I think Oakwood Historical Society had some, Mound had some, but they did not have information as to the original source. Where had they come from? I couldn't use them without having that information. And it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Where in these millions of Manhattan Project records were those things? I eventually zeroed in on Atlanta, which holds some of the records, and working with a very patient archivist over the phone, we zeroed in on a folder, and then it was just a complete shot in the dark. Maybe in this, what did they call them? Tertiary facility, demolition, 1940 to 1946. There are hundreds of folders. Well, I guess let's start somewhere, and I asked to have the contents of, I think, 6 folders sent to me on a DVD. And some of you, if you go beyond a certain number, you have to pay for them. So you cannot say I'd like 5,000 records unless you want to pay a fortune to see those records. By the grace of God, one of those folders had the pictures, and some of these are from that file. My mail carrier delivered that package to me and said, "Boy, I don't know what you're doing, but this Nuclear Security Administration packet is pretty interesting." So, one of my personal regrets is that I never saw the Playhouse at its finest. It really must have been quite a facility. And then to have seen the pre-Dayton Project photos and the post as it was torn down is fairly moving for me. It was gutted, and then there was nothing. And there is, as I showed earlier, that nice grassy hillside with a house sitting on the corner there. Now to the people. the people who really motivated me to write this book. When I first started on the project, I saw a brown bag lunch advertised at Purdue. And it was a chemical engineering professor speaking about his work in the Manhattan Project at the Hanford, Washington nuclear reactors, at that site where they did mass production of plutonium. So I thought, well, I'll go and maybe I'll talk to him after the speech. And I went up to him after he had spoken, and I said, you know, I've got a story for you. My grandfather oversaw some work in Dayton where they purified polonium, and he said, no, that's not possible. And I said, yes, it really is. It really did happen, and I've got a manuscript started, and I'll share it with you. This was shortly after my trip over here in '05. And so I would go and visit Lyle Albright in his Purdue office. He was, you know, obviously an older man at this point. And he was absolutely fascinated. You see, during the Manhattan Project, one person could not talk to another about what they were doing. Here in Dayton, one person in one lab didn't know what the person in the next lab was doing. They kept information completely separated, they called it compartmentalization, to try to guard the safety of the entire project. And it was the best they could do in that day and age, and it worked pretty well. So Lyle and Hanford, although they were shipping product to Dayton and receiving product from Dayton, had absolutely no idea about the existence of the project until he met me late in his life. And we formed a fast friendship. I dedicated my book to him. He was determined that I write the book and became a little bit of a pest about it. I was working full-time at Purdue and would kind of dig away at the research on the side. And he would call and say, do you have that book done yet? And I would say, no, Lyle, I haven't had a chance to. But he wanted it written because he wanted the men and women of the Manhattan Project who were not at the big sites, not at Oak Ridge, not at Los Alamos. He wanted the rest of the folks involved with the project to get credit. And he had a big bone to pick with histories and newspaper coverage of the Manhattan Project that had not taken the scope of the project into account. And so I'm very pleased to have finally finished that book. He died before he knew it was finished, but I think he probably does because I'm not hearing from him anymore. So part of my work was trying to find any of these men and women who worked on the project who were still alive and could share their experience with me. And I was late to the party. Many of them had passed away. And that remains a big frustration. I'm very sorry I did not get to hear their stories or share them in the book. But I did reach out to families, wives, sons, daughters, grandchildren, and was able to find some and include those in the book. These pictures are mounted. I've had them enlarged and mounted, and they are out in the lobby area for you to take a look at after the program. I'm always on a quest to find people who were involved with the Dayton Project and to identify them. And if each of you has a chance to take a quick look at those photos, and if you recognize someone, please let me know, or please let someone from the Oakwood Historical Society know, because there are more stories and more histories to include that are not in the book. So please take a look after the program. These families did provide photos of their fathers and mothers, and I'm very grateful to those families. Mary Lou Curtis, Sergio De Benedetti just looks like he was a character, and I think he was, from reports that I get. He was a physicist and was apparently very intense, but he looks like he was kind of a little bit of a jokester too. Harry Weimer, up in the upper left, from a canning family in rural Indiana, called out of Ball State University to join the project. And this picture is from 1940, so his children were aware that their daddy was gone most of the week somewhere. They didn't know where, but Mom would pick him up at the bus in Fort Wayne on his weekends off, and he would come home from Dayton. And then there's the famous Soviet spy, George Koval. Miraculously was able to enlist in the Army's Special Engineer Detachment. He was Iowa born, so he was a U.S. citizen. And he was in Oak Ridge and then transferred up to Dayton just about the time that the polonium problem was solved and that they began mass production. As a physics health inspector, sweeping the laboratories for radiation, he had access to all the facilities and therefore to a lot of information. He passed that on to the Soviet Union. Don Sullinger from Mound will talk about that in this very space in November. So I'll stop there, but he's a fascinating part of the history. There's not a whole lot known. I know there are some historians working on books about him right now. And we come to my very favorite find in doing this research, and that has become a real gift to me. A young woman named Betty Hallie Jones joined the project. One of the things that I like to always speak about is that there were a number of women at that time working in highly technical physics and radiation counting and other areas. And many of them stayed with that after the war. As a person who is working for a technical university at Purdue, one of my jobs has frequently been to encourage younger women to get into what they now call the STEM disciplines: science, technology, engineering, and math. And I am so privileged and so honored today that Betty Jones has joined us, and she will speak with you about her experience with the Dayton Project. I will bring her up to the stage. Come on up, Betty.
First of all, I'd like to expand a little bit on what she was saying about the bomb, or the bomb test. When they exploded, the test, we of course didn't know about that. But in '45, when the bomb was dropped on Japan, I started in May 5th, 45, and the bombs were dropped in August, and that was the first any of us knew that we were working on that project. And they told us that afterwards. But going back a little bit to the work that I had done before I started the project, I had worked for Jameson Electronics for a while. First of all, I took some courses at Wright-Patterson in electronics and mechanical drafting. But then I worked for Jameson Electronics until they moved out of town to Kansas City. And at that time, we were grinding radio frequency crystals for the walkie-talkies that the men had in the field. And then after he moved out of town, I went to work for Univis Lens and was inspecting prisms that were used in the periscopes of the submarines. But then in early May 45, I'll go back now to where I started. May 5th, 45, my mother asked me to go with her to apply for a job that she had read about in the paper. She wanted me as support. She had never worked before. But when we got there, a guard met us at the gate. There was gates, and took us to a room saying he would call someone to come down. And the interviewing person was Dr. Joseph Hyde. During the interview with Mother, he suddenly turned to me and asked if I was working and what my experience was. I told him that I had worked for Jameson Electronics and was presently employed by Univis Lens. I could not tell him what I had done, as they were both classified. He paused for a second and said, and this startled me, "We want you here to start work Monday morning." He turned to leave, but stopped and said, "Don't worry about leaving Univis. We'll take care of that." Then he said, "We will see you here Monday morning at 8 o'clock. Well, needless to say, I was stunned, and Mother was even more so. Monday morning was the start of my 34 years of service with Monsanto, working for and with Dr. Joseph Hyde in the electronics laboratory, working along with Will Conacher and Bob Gunter Moore, both of whom were from the Special Services of the military. Two really, really great young men, both to work with and easy to learn from. I remained with Monsanto the transition of the Manhattan Project to the takeover of the Atomic Energy Commission. We moved to Mound in 1949 into the new electronics building. The personnel from the Playhouse went into the top secret underground building designated as T, or technical. The years that I worked for Monsanto, I was given experiences that stunned, surprised, and left me wonder many times how these could have happened. In early 1955, well into the Cold War, Mound was preparing to close down due to lack of new contracts. We were, however, doing a very small project for Livermore, California, when I got a call to report to Lloyd Nagy's office. When I arrived, he asked if I had taken my vacation yet. Replying that I had not, he said I was to start immediately and then meet him at the Albuquerque airport in 2 weeks. Then I would be going to Los Alamos for 6 weeks. Stunned? You bet I was. I met him at the airport in Albuquerque as requested and was told there would be 9 other people, all men, from Mound representing various areas of producing detonators. But that I would concentrate on the bridge wire assembly technique, soldering technique, as Los Alamos was having an extremely high rate of rejects in that area. When returning home, I was to set up the lab and start training solderers, ultimately leading to the War Reserve grade detonators. In December, 5 other people were sent for training in the fields that they would be responsible for, such as weighing and pressing of explosives, inspection of the head or bridge wire assembly, final inspection of the completed detonator, and the test firing of random samples of the completed assembly. For the better part of 2 years, we worked 2 shifts, including Christmas and New Year's. We sold our first lot of WR grade detonators in early 1958. Celebrations were surely in order, and how we celebrated. Pictures were taken, and all those involved gave high fives. After selling our first lot of completed detonators, I transferred back to the development department. In 1961, I was again sent to Los Alamos to help in the cutting and bending of MDF for the use in the timers. They were having trouble at that time bending the MDF and then cutting it so that the lead shield that was covering the PETN core was not smearing across the core. In 1968, I was given the responsibility of the WR detonator that was now controlled by Sandia Albuquerque, working directly with the Sandia engineers. Any changes, small or large, were to be recorded. Excuse me. Drawings corrected to reflect the changes, and a report sent to all individuals that had daily contact and daily communication with Sandia, and oftentimes with trips from both. The drawings corrected to reflect the changes, and a report went to all those involved. It was daily communications with Sandia, and oftentimes trips both directions. In early 1972, I was directed to go to Pantex in Texas, along with our quality control engineer, Frank Jones, in doing a random inspection of the bomb's explosive assemblies stored at Pantex. Their quality control engineer was notified of a suspect detonator. It was my responsibility to remove that detonator and replace it with a good one. We arrived early morning at Pantex and was taken to a van where several other people were waiting. We were driven many miles out into the desert to a Quonset hut. Before going in, a guard took our badges, then he and the van left with our badges. Once inside, we were faced with a full explosive sphere of the atomic bomb detonators and the sphere with the explosive, with the explosive part of the detonator facing inward and wired with a cable going in all directions to each detonator. I was to replace the subject detonator with a good one. All eyes were on me, and as I was doing the work. Replacement completed, we left the hut, given our badges, and left for our ride back through the desert to the main building of Pantex. We were told the reason for taking their badges was in an account to identify those inside in the event something might have happened and an explosion occurred. I wouldn't be here now if it had. My time with MAN was full of exciting work with many, many different engineers. Thank you.
What a story. She really is a gem. Just a wonderful history, and as I said, an example of one of the women pioneering in the STEM disciplines. Deserves a lot of credit. So I did find her, and not only was able to add her to the book, but she's become a dear friend, and so that's important, and I'm just thrilled that Betty was able to be here today. After the war ended, and the secret of the bomb work was out, the Manhattan Project and the Dayton Project were eventually disbanded. The work was turned over to what became the brand new Atomic Energy Commission that Betty mentioned. And the work in Dayton was transferred to a facility initially known as Unit 5, the fifth of the Dayton Project units, the Playhouse being Unit 4, and became known eventually as Manned Laboratory, and that is where Betty and all of her escapades took place. A woman detonating bombs is someone everyone's got to meet. So to celebrate the opening of this new laboratory, and kind of in a reflection of the time, Monsanto and the city of Miamisburg, where Manned is, the footprint is still there and was located. They put together a kind of a community event that they called the Atomic Energy Show. The details of nuclear science were not well known at all. It was a new field. The questions of how the bomb had worked and so forth were out there. And of course, I think it was what they call a good community relations move to show the friendly side of nuclear power. And there was some truth, I think, to the American citizenry being afraid of this new field because it had just done an unfathomable damage in Japan. But I didn't know anything about this at all, but I came to Dayton again in 2016 to round up the final photos for my book, and was over at Wright State going through archives and came across a folder on the Atomic Energy Show, and I thought, this is fabulous. This helps continue the story of what happened after the Dayton Project ended. And something like 6,000 area high school students attended this. They came to workshops and lectures, and it was meant to really to educate the public about the positive possibilities of nuclear science. I'm going to read from one of the publicity materials because I think it's still relevant today. So as the show promotion went, this is the first show of its kind. It is without parallel. It represents a once-in-a-lifetime chance to get a graphic, permanent education on a subject that is quite possibly the most important matter in the life of every American. Seeing it, appreciating it, is an obligation of parents to children, because it is our children who will grow up, think, and live in the atomic age. I, and many of you in the audience, are children of the atomic age. In May of 2017, a week before my book was published, I was diagnosed with cancer. This wasn't the plan. Wasn't supposed to happen. I was excited to have my book published and to come to Dayton shortly after that to speak with all of you. Instead, I headed to Houston and the MD Anderson Center and underwent a summer of proton radiation treatment. This is the gantry where I was treated every day, and my best friend, my radiation mask, is in the foreground. I'd like to think that this experience brought me closer to my book subject, closer to the other side of the nuclear science that was first explored during the Manhattan Project, the peacetime medical use of radiation for the good of human health and a means to my current state of remission. My grandfather would probably have approved. He spent a lot of time after the war as a presidential and government advisor on the peaceful use of nuclear energy for medicine and for energy. Outside of his life as a chemist, industrialist, and advisor, he was an extremely social animal. He was a professional singer and a performer, known to entertain with magic at Monsanto meetings. It's only fitting then that I leave you with this image of him in a relaxed setting. This was a Talbot family reunion in Canada where they spent a lot of time. And I have to say, he was still dressed to impress. It looks a bit, when I saw it, I thought it looks a bit like the Rat Pack. And there, I apologize, there is a song I have attached to the PowerPoint of him singing, When You're Young at Heart. Some of you may know that song. It was his favorite song, and I think a trademark of his optimism and his youthful, always inquiring mind. Both of those qualities were important to all Manhattan engineers and scientists. And with that, I will end the project, but I have one question before I close. Did any of you live in the area during World War II? And if you did, would you raise your hands? Okay, and I invite anyone who did and who read the book and thought the information was wrong to approach me. I'm very approachable. Or if you have stories to add to it, I'm always eager to hear those and would encourage you to let the Oakwood Historical Society know, and they can put us in contact. So thank you so much for spending a Sunday afternoon with me. Your support of the subject and the book really means a lot. It was obviously, it was not 50 Shades of Grey. I am not wealthy from it, but my spirit is, and my soul is, and that was the reason for writing the book. Thank you so much. We have time for questions if anyone has any for me, and that's a good question. When the Playhouse was taken over, was it donated? Was there ever any remuneration for it? It belonged to the Talbot Realty Company, which was kind of a conglomerate of Catherine Talbot's descendants, and it was leased. The War Department leased it, which I was just speaking with one of my Talbot cousins who still lives here, and we were talking about that yesterday, and it's fairly amazing that they were able to lease it and not just take it, because the War Department could do that for national emergency, which this was considered. It was leased, and there are actually some court proceeding documents that I got my hands on after the war. Did the government owe the Talbots as much as they had agreed on? Because the lease kept being extended, which is another indicator of how important the Polonium project was. I think the initial lease was maybe for a year, and then it was extended another 6 months, and then extended another 6 months. In the end, and I actually would have to refer to my own book for a figure, but I think it was about $6,000, and the land was returned, but obviously the building couldn't be. The government took care of that demolition, and Monsanto pitched in as well. But at that time, 6,000 was a fairly substantial amount of money. So. I don't believe so. If you think so, please share that with us. But it's actually surprising that given the number of people who worked with such toxic materials in the early days of working with radioactive materials, it was probably quite horrifying in modern day terms to look back at what procedures were in place to protect them. But no, across the Manhattan Project, that figure is not inordinate. In fact, I've read that, and the EPA has continued to follow this, I've read that the statistics actually are not much higher than the incidence of cancer in the general population. There were, of course, publicized examples of people dying early of stomach cancer, or there's the Slotkin radioactive disaster where there was exposure and he died almost instantly. But no, that's an area I did not explore, the health physics area I did not explore at length. That's a very interesting area. So, there may be another book coming. It's my understanding, and I did speak with some people at Mound Laboratory yesterday who actually worked, not at the time doing it, but have worked in that area. Some of it was taken to Mound, but most of it was put in barrels and shipped to Oak Ridge. And from there, some of it is now in Utah. Polonium, fortunately, has a pretty short half-life, so its toxicity didn't hang around as long, although I just spoke with someone yesterday who begged to differ. So that's a good question for chemistry. The polonium work here was for both of them. The little boy did not really need it. It did not need the polonium to trigger the explosion. That was a gun type of model. But Fat Man with its initiator did, and it really solved the problem of the plutonium bomb and avoiding early detonation. And so it was in both, but it really was focused for the Fat Man? That's a good question. I mean, there really were so many. I think at the back of my book, I listed some of the industries that were involved, and those ran from mom and pop mechanical garages to huge industries. You know, we know DuPont was the biggest of them all, but you know, I don't know. I don't know if all of the stories have been out there. Actually, Ames, Iowa, played a pretty big role. It has not gotten attention. I went to a conference put on by the Atomic Heritage Foundation, which is in Washington, D.C., was founded by a woman who left the Atomic Energy Commission. And it really is the keeper of all Manhattan Project oral histories. They have a wonderful selection. If you go online, it's ahf.org, and they like to collect stories. They have some stuff on the Dayton Project. And I went to a conference they hosted and met somebody whose grandfather had worked at Ames, and at that point neither of us had a book in the works, but we were both determined to tell the stories. So there's more to come, for sure.
Fairy tales can come true, it can happen to you if you're young at heart. For it's hard, you will find, to be narrow of mind if you're young at heart. You can go to extremes with impossible schemes. You can laugh when your dreams fall apart at the seams. And life gets more exciting with each passing day. Love is either in your heart or on its way. Don't you know it is worth every treasure on earth to be young at heart? For as rich as you are, it's much better by far to be young at heart. And if you should survive to 105, look at all you derive by being alive. And here comes the best part. You'll have a head start if you are among the very young at heart.